Deep within the subterranean shadows, a chorus of silent agony echoes through the stillness. Dozens of faces stare outward from the gloom, their jaws stretched wide, their eyes sunken into cavernous hollows, their skin pulled taut over bone like ancient yellowed parchment. These are not the carefully prepared pharaohs of antiquity, wrapped in linen and anointed with sacred resins for a journey into the afterlife. They are ordinary men, women, and children, frozen in expressions of profound, unutterable terror. Their contorted features suggest a desperate, suffocating struggle, as if they spent their final moments clawing at the lids of their own coffins. This is the horrifying spectacle of the screaming mummies, a macabre assembly that forces us to confront the absolute vulnerability of the human form. The origin of this nightmare lies in Guanajuato, Mexico, a city nestled in a narrow, winding valley, renowned for its opulent colonial architecture and immense subterranean veins of silver. Throughout the early 19th century, it was a place of stark contrasts, where immense wealth flowed into the hands of a few, while the vast majority toiled in the suffocating darkness of the mines. The earth beneath their feet was rich, but it was also uniquely arid, laced with nitrates and alum. It was a geological anomaly that would soon conspire with a catastrophic human tragedy to produce an unimaginable harvest. In the year 1833, a shadow fell over the Silver City. It did not come from the deep mines, but from the tainted water and the unwashed streets. A devastating cholera epidemic swept through the population with terrifying speed. Cholera, a virulent bacterial infection of the small intestine, was poorly understood at the time, thriving in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the impoverished working class. It struck without warning, draining the life from its victims through severe dehydration in a matter of hours. The afflicted would collapse in the streets, their bodies violently purging fluids, their skin turning a ghastly shade of blue as their blood thickened and their organs failed. The sheer volume of the dead quickly overwhelmed the city's infrastructure. Churches overflowed with corpses, and the tolling of the death bells became a continuous, maddening dirge that echoed off the valley walls. Gravediggers worked to the point of exhaustion, hastily carving out new trenches and expanding the Santa Paula cemetery to accommodate the endless influx of the deceased. In the frantic rush to dispose of the highly contagious bodies, many were buried immediately, wrapped only in simple shrouds, without the customary rituals or sturdy wooden caskets that might have shielded them from the elements. The earth swallowed them whole, but it would not keep them. Decades passed, and the immediate terror of the outbreak faded into memory. But the bureaucratic machinery of the state introduced a new, insidious form of cruelty. The local government enacted a perpetual burial tax. It was a cold, calculated levy imposed on the families of the deceased, requiring them to pay a steep annual fee to maintain their loved ones' resting places within the cemetery walls. For the wealthy, it was a minor inconvenience. For the descendants of the impoverished miners who had perished in the epidemic, it was an impossible burden. Poverty, it seemed, was a crime that extended even beyond the grave. When the payments inevitably lapsed, the authorities took swift, merciless action. The eviction of the dead began. Gravediggers were dispatched into the crypts and the sun-baked earth of Santa Paula with orders to exhume the bodies of the tax delinquents, making room for fresh, paying occupants. It was a grim utilitarian harvest, driven by the cold logic of municipal finance. The workers expected to find nothing more than brittle bones and dust, the natural remnants of lives extinguished decades prior. Instead, as they cracked open the sealed crypts and turned the dry earth, they were met with a sight that defied all reason and provoked absolute horror. The bodies had not decayed. The unique alchemy of Guanajuato's soil, combined with the incredibly dry climate and the tightly sealed, oxygen-deprived crypts, had arrested the normal process of decomposition. The corpses had undergone natural mummification, a rare phenomenon where the tissues desiccate so rapidly that bacteria cannot survive to break down the flesh. The victims of 1833 emerged from the dark, perfectly preserved, their skin transformed into a tough, leathery hide, their hair and fingernails still stubbornly attached to their shriveled forms. Yet it was not merely their preservation that sent the gravediggers reeling in terror. It was their expressions. The dead appeared to be screaming. Their mouths were gaping black holes, their facial muscles pulled back in grimaces of excruciating pain. The immediate, terrifying assumption was that these unfortunates had been buried alive, hastily entombed during the chaotic height of the epidemic, while still clinging to a faint spark of life. The mind recoiled at the thought of waking in the suffocating pitch black, tearing at a shroud, screaming for a mercy that would never come. The chilling reality of these horrified dead, however, is rooted in the inescapable mechanics of biology rather than premature burial. When a human body expires, rigor mortis eventually passes, leaving the muscles entirely flaccid. In the absence of a casket or proper binding, the lower jaw naturally drops open as the ligaments slacken. As the intense dry heat of the crypts rapidly drew the moisture from the corpses, the skin shrank and contracted, pulling tightly across the skull, drawing the lips back from the teeth and forcing the jaw further ajar. The screaming mummies were not voicing the agony of their final moments. They were displaying the grotesque, mechanical reality of their desiccation. The exhumed bodies, unwanted and unclaimed, posed a bizarre logistical problem for the cemetery authorities. They could not simply be thrown away, yet they had no rightful place in the consecrated ground. The solution was as pragmatic as it was macabre. The mummies were unceremoniously dragged into a subterranean ossuary beneath the cemetery walls, stacked against the stone corridors like morbid cords of wood. In the gloom of the catacombs, the victims of the cholera epidemic were left to gather dust, a hidden legion of the disenfranchised dead. But secrets of such a grotesque nature cannot remain buried forever. Whispers of the perfectly preserved, screaming corpses began to circulate through the taverns and plazas of the city. Curiosity, a deeply ingrained and often morbid human trait, soon overcame the natural revulsion of the citizenry. By the late 19th century, intrepid travelers and locals alike were slipping a few pesos to the cemetery workers, bribing them for a clandestine tour of the underground ossuary. The gravediggers, recognizing a lucrative opportunity, began to prop the best-preserved specimens against the walls, arranging them for the viewing pleasure of their paying guests. What began as a shadowy, illicit enterprise gradually evolved into a formal institution. The municipal government, observing the steady stream of curious onlookers, seized control of the spectacle. The underground ossuary was expanded, well-lit, and officially branded. It became the Museo de las Momias, a museum dedicated entirely to the display of the exhumed, mummified remains of the city's poorest residents. The very people who had been evicted from their graves because they could not afford the burial tax were now generating substantial revenue for the city that had cast them out. There is a profound, unsettling irony in the existence of this institution. The display stripped these individuals of their final shreds of dignity, transforming profound human suffering into a roadside attraction. Visitors filed past glass cases, staring into the hollow eyes of a tragedy they could scarcely comprehend. The mummies were often given sensationalized nicknames by the guides, their tragic histories overwritten by fabricated tales of murder, betrayal, and supernatural curses to thrill the crowds. The true horror of their existence, the slow, agonizing death by disease and the subsequent betrayal by their society, was overshadowed by the sheer shock value of their physical appearance. Among the most tragic figures in this silent assembly are the infants. dressed in the decaying remnants of their burial clothes, some still wearing the tiny bonnets placed upon their heads by grieving mothers. They serve as a devastating testament to the indiscriminate cruelty of the epidemic. In 19th century Mexican tradition, young children who died were sometimes dressed as angelitos, little angels, a coping mechanism for parents facing an unbearable loss. Now, these little angels stand rigid behind glass, their tiny mouths frozen in the same silent, terrifying scream as the adults, forever denied the peaceful slumber their parents had prayed for. The shadow of that ancient horror still stretched across the valley for generations. The practice of exhuming bodies for failure to pay the burial tax continued well into the mid-20th century, steadily adding new recruits to the museum's silent army. It was not until 1958 that the law was finally abolished, ending the grotesque harvest. Yet, the legacy of that legislation remains entirely intact, preserved behind the reinforced glass of the museum's display cases. The unique geographical trap of the region had captured not just the bodies, but the very essence of a deeply flawed societal structure. To look upon these figures is to look into a mirror reflecting the darkest aspects of our own history. They force us to question the boundaries of reverence, the commercialization of tragedy, and the ways in which society discards its most vulnerable members even after their hearts have stopped beating. The museum stands not merely as a collection of biological curiosities, but as a monument to the intersection of natural disaster and bureaucratic cruelty. The dead of Guanajuato did not choose to become eternal ambassadors of dread. They were conscripted into this role by a relentless disease, a punishing environment, and a society that placed a monetary value on eternal rest. Their contorted faces continue to draw thousands of visitors each year, a testament to humanity's enduring fascination with its own mortality. As the heavy doors of the museum close and the subterranean lights flicker out, the silent chorus remains in the dark. Their jaws remain stretched, their hollow eyes staring into the void. The screaming mummies endure, trapped in a purgatory of our own making, a chilling reminder that sometimes the true horror does not end when the breath leaves the body. It begins when the living decide that the dead no longer have the right to disappear.